I'm Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually majors on geopolitics. And today is no exception. Well, actually, it's a little bit of an exception because, as regular listeners will know, and by the way, please do subscribe and listen regularly, I generally work now in tandem with my podcast other half, the sort of central other perspective ego of the show, the one who aids with a view of what the everyday person thinks, because she aids in giving those everyday people a perspective, and that's the perspective of the media. So generally I'm working in tandem with Fergus Isaac. However, today is an exception because, as you may know, when we basically come to the end of season, and this is season 10, episode 10, I often do either an overview or what I call a critical thinking issue, which I tend to do by myself. Well, today's no exception, so what I'm going to do is look at a critical issue. And today's critical issue, I think, is something that I'm going to call, well, which we call in the actual secret intelligence game. And I say a game because if you're interested in secret intelligence and national security, you are well aware of the phrase from the 19th century that was coined actually by the British Secret Service in India, which is known as the Great Game. So effectively, this is why I say the game. So yeah, today what I want to do is I want to look at, as I said, what is coined in the game as basically it's the perspective that you provide to individuals via various means. And that's really a psychological perspective that's provided. Can be via the media, can be via pressing or putting in a specific area, something which we know individuals will listen, hear, and then regurgitate later on. So that can be history example. And in this show, I will look at revisionism, so how history has been portrayed. Also, you get the perspective of what we want you in the secret world, and also in the political world, what we want you to believe is true. And that's done via means, again, using the media, generally the written press in the old days. Now, obviously, it's all of the media facets. So we'll look at the Ukraine example from that perspective. And I also want to take a look at the issue now with Niger. And again, you will see how historically that perspective, in terms of psychological operations, has been put across, and what people tend to think because of that. So all in all, we're going to look at how you, the listener, obtains what you think are the actual facts of what's going on in the world today, and by extension, your life and the things that you deal with. So, in order to kind of establish this and to give you a feel of how it can be distorted, I want to look at two things to start off with right in the beginning. I'll choose the Second World War. Why? Because everybody's familiar with it in some way, shape or means. Even if you're not politically sensitive to a lot of things, you are sensitive to the fact that the Second World War took place. You may or may not know the dates of that, and the dates may change depending upon which country you come from. But you are aware who won that war, and you're also aware who lost that war. And you'll also be aware, actually, potentially incorrectly, why the war was fought. So I wanted to show you how this psychological operations can make you think things that are not a reality. So let's start off with this first example of the Second World War. So I'm an Englishman, and I grew up believing that the United Kingdom, and in my day when I was first looking at this back in the early 60s, we used to use the word England rather than the United Kingdom. So when we said England won the war, it was England. I didn't really think of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. I just really thought of England. And this has changed over the years, especially as we have devolved government. But prior to that, I just thought of England. And when I was told England stood alone to fight against Nazism and to fight against the dastardly things that they've been doing to, say, Jewish people, the concentration camps, and to prevent that happening, we fought the Second World War, and obviously to protect Poland, etc. And that the Germans started the war, so therefore they're at fault with everything that happened. Well, when you actually start to look at the issue and understand Psyops, psychological operations, you begin to realise that actually the Germans didn't start the war in an official sense. So Britain and France declared war on Germany, not the other way around. And of course, the more you read, the more you understand that there was never any real intention by the Germans to declare war on the United Kingdom in particular. And if they could get away with it, France as well. What they really wanted was the opportunity in the East, and you can read for that in a general perspective, the Soviet Union, because that was the aim, to get to the Soviet Union. But in the first instance, Poland, Czechoslovakia, as it was in those days, Hungary, etc. Now, Hungary was a little bit of a question because they had some overtures with the Hungarians that were going to work on the side of the Germans. So it was what Hitler called Lebensraum in the East, living room in the East, that he wanted. But he wanted to conquer his main enemy, which was Bolshevism, communism of old. Now, frankly, we had no problem with that, we being the United Kingdom, other than the fact that obviously if Germans were successful, it would make them the most powerful country in Europe. And of course, that would then undermine us as the United Kingdom. Same for France. It would undermine the French. So that could not happen. And hence, the perspective of declaring war on the Germans when they took over Poland, or went into war against Poland. But again, what should be noted, there was never an opportunity or never any real attempt to carry out any actions in Poland against the Germans, any war fighting, because we knew that wasn't possible. So that in itself was a red herring. So again, just looking at the very beginning of the war in Western Europe, you can see that what we were told wasn't true. The other bit, that's what we were told, the extermination of Jewish people. And we only concentrated on Jewish people. We didn't take any account of the extermination of gypsies, which were exterminated in exactly the same way, or of communists who were to be exterminated in exactly the same way once extermination came about. But in the first instances, up to 1941, obviously what was happening to these individuals is that they were put in concentration camps and taken off the land and deported, etc., etc., etc. So the so-called final solution, which Hitler called it, was not in place until 1941, so 2 years after the war had actually started. And of course, we never really articulated the fact that the attacks were taken against gypsies as well. Why? Because they were of no interest to us. So again, when you start studying, you start seeing these things. Now, also what we realise is that the Americans came into the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The more you read, the more you will learn that actually the American system, FBI, State Department, even the Hawaiian Police Special Branch, actually knew of a potential of an attack. What had happened is that Churchill had got that information and passed that information on via SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service of the United Kingdom, better known as MI6, passed that on to the Americans, who, for whatever reason, took no notice. But what we do know is that when the attack came in on Pearl Harbor, that the actual aircraft carriers were not in place, albeit that some battleships were in place, which were destroyed by the attack from the Japanese naval forces. So there's always been a question, and I think that question has to be asked. Did, in reality, Roosevelt know, Franklin Delano that is, know, the President of the United States, that the attack was going to take place, and that the only way to get into the Second World War and to potentially obtain the riches from that post the Second World War, when, if the Western Allies won that war, would be to, and by that time, by the way, not only the Western Allies, also obviously the Soviet Union fighting the war, was to actually be part of the war. But the American public had zero interest in reality, very little interest. And also, not only the public, some really powerful politicians. Example, who would end up later on, Kennedy, who was the ambassador to the United Kingdom and would end up later on to be the father of the President of the United States, did not want to enter the war. One, because of his Irish heritage, but two, because he felt the US should not get involved in a European war. There are others that said that he was probably pro-Nazi, pro-German that is, but I don't know enough about that. I've not really evidenced that in any way. But the bottom line is there was no real clamour, no thirst to get involved in the war. So obviously the pretext of Pearl Harbor being attacked, which by the way could have been foreseen, the Japanese naval codes were broken by the Americans anyway, so again that may well have been picked up. And there are suggestions by a British code breaker, and when I say British, he was in the New Zealand Navy, but obviously in those days tied to, because when Britain stood alone, it didn't stand alone, it stood with the rest of the empire, which obviously included also the dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India, in addition to the imperial countries of empire, which were all the East African states, some of the West African states who were part of the British Empire, obviously all of the West Indies, Hong Kong, and other parts of Asia that were part of the Malaysia, that were parts of the British Empire, Singapore, etc., etc., etc. So what I'm saying is there was some knowledge that by the Americans that this was going to take place, and more people are now coming to the fore that Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew and basically undertook no action to prevent Pearl Harbor from happening because he needed a pretext for entry into the Second World War. I'll leave that with you for you to do the research. And with everything I say, please do research it. Don't just take it at face value. If you do take anything away from the Black Spy podcast, it's do not take at face value what I tell you. Search it up yourself, look at it, find out about it, and then go that step further to make your own opinion as to what is or is not or could not have taken place. So yes, so we've got that perspective of the Second World War. Then we have probably the primary perspective of the Second World War, which is who won it. Now, we argue we won the war. I grew up thinking we won the war. It was only when I really started studying it further and looked at what the Germans thought and started speaking to the Germans. I speak the language and spoke the language fluently at the time and could speak to the Germans. I guess still do, but in those days like a native, and could speak to Germans, ex-German fighters. So I knew people who were in, example, the SS, in the Panzer units. I knew pilots who were in the Luftwaffe. I knew soldiers in the General German Army, in the Wehrmacht. And I would speak to these ex-individuals and get their feel on the Second World War. And what I quickly... and I knew some guys who were in the U-boat, in the submarine fleet. So... yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really know surface fleet individuals. But anyway, I spoke to these these various individuals, and I got from them that actually, as they perceived it, particularly the SS, Panzergrenadier, and who was in charge of a Panzer unit, Sturmbandführer, and also then a pilot in the Luftwaffe who would originally fly in Stukas. I got from them that actually the war wasn't won in the West, the war was won in the East. So then I start looking at it, which is what I'm saying to you, look up these things. And I realise that of these something like 7.7 million Germans who lost their life in the Second World War. Soldiers now I'm talking about as a general rule. Now, the civilian losses, in the first instance, from bombing was obviously, the power of the bombing was down to the RAF and the US Army Air Force. So, yes, what happened is the bombings that were carried on by the Western forces, as I say, mainly those two forces, weakened Germany to some extent, but not to the extent in any way, shape or means of them giving up. It did hit their industrial might, but generally, as a general rule, the industrial capacity was brought back online quite quickly. What did for them was their losses in the battles in the East against the Red Army. Now, as I said, of the 7.odd million who died, it would appear that 6.8 million of those Germans died on the Eastern Front. So you can see that that's where the massive amount of losses were for the German armies. Now, when we go over to the Soviets, we will see that the Soviet Union lost something like, and now I'm hearing figures of up to 40 million, but the established figures about 27 million Soviet dead. But we're hearing, if you study it now, laterally you'll hear some people talk about 40 million Soviet dead. And I'm talking dead now, I'm not talking injured, right? This was taking the battle to Germany. Now, you'll find people turn around and say, oh, well, they allowed the soldiers to be killed en masse. That's not necessarily true. I mean, the soldiers did die en masse, absolutely. But were the generals any more or any less foolhardy with the losses of their men than they were on the West? I suggest not. I just suggest the fighting was much harder. And the fighting, as Hitler put it, was a Vernichtungskrieg, which means a war of destruction. So in other words, no Kolditz for Soviet soldiers captured. No, these people were often starved to death on death marches or treated so abysmally and experimented on so dastardly that these people died in captivity. So it's millions of German soldiers captured in those first months of the war, Fall of Ice, Operation Barbarossa, Case White, the Operation Barbarossa was the name of the operation, the attack on the east from the Germans, that these people, basically when they were captured en masse, the Soviet Red Army was captured en masse, these people, most of them who were taken at that time, died in camp. So why is it then that when we look at our losses, British losses, and that includes the non-Dominion British Empire losses as well, so all you West Indians serving in the Navy, Hong Kongers serving in the Navy, your when ships were going down, your West Africa Regiment serving out in Burma or wherever else, your East Africa Regiment serving out in the East as well, your West Indian Regiment serving out there, all of these sort of losses, all the civilian losses to the Blitz, and then the losses of British, i.e. UK British soldiers, all that added up to about 450,000 dead. So you've heard me talk about 27 million Soviet dead, and now throughout the 6 years of our war, we lost 450,000 dead, including civilians, etc., etc. Right. The American lost about the same, fighting on both fronts in the United States, in the West, and obviously across in the East, as we were fighting in the East as well, in the Pacific. So 450,000 approximation, give or take. So why is it that we won the war then, when the Soviet losses were literally 50 times our losses? Why do we not say the Soviet Union won the war? I ask you that question. This is what I mean with psychological operations, with propaganda. Because by the end of the war, we knew that the new enemy was the Soviet Union. So the last thing we wanted to do was make their people heroic. So therefore, we undermined their losses. I was talking, funnily enough, to an old soldier, just an ex-Marine, British Royal Marine, and he was fighting with the Royal Marines, and he fought his way up to the north, and he was in Arnhem, the Battle of Arnhem, and then on just to the German border. And he said to me, we stopped. He said, we shouldn't have done. We should have taken Berlin. And I said to him, really? And he said, yeah, we should have just gone and taken Berlin, because that way we'd have had full control of Berlin and Germany. I said, do you know how many people it cost the Soviet Red Army to take Berlin? If you just take the month battle of Berlin, if you just take that monthly battle, the figures are something like dead, 250, 270 odd to 300,000 dead. So put that in context. That's 2/3 of all British losses, just in the battle for Berlin. That's just in the month battle, long battle. If you take it, the Battle of Berlin as it was seen by General Zhukov, when it's coming in from the whole of what was Eastern Germany, Prussia, coming across, then that's a 6-month battle to a year battle. That cost them way more, probably even more, 1 million odd dead. So just if you're taking a short burst of that battle, the month-long battle, we'd have put another 2/3 on our battle dead in the Second World War. But that soldier had never been told that. Because when I said that to him, he said, what? That soldier had never understood what those losses were. Because, of course, at the end of the war, his enemy was the Soviet Union. So why do I mention this? Because it's how your mindset can be set. Let's take it off warfare. Let's do it on something completely different. Let's look at the suffragette movement. So the suffragette movement, rightly or wrongly, I happen to think rightly, actively took actions to try and get votes for women. Now, again, rightly or wrongly, they went into taking actions after passive activity and peaceful demonstration activity. Some of them then went into more active actions in terms of bombings. There were a couple of bombings, etc. But, the active actions were such that they were carrying out what we would now call terroristic actions. And it's the old saying, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. But I gave a talk not that long ago to some sixth form individuals, and they basically said what we wanted with the suffragette women, they were women, girls, 18-year-old girls, women, they actually said what we wanted with the suffragette movement was to have the right to vote like men. We just wanted, universal suffrage, all men, all women, just the same as all men. And I had to stop them and I said, hang on, all men didn't have a right to vote. So once again, you see, the way the propaganda was played was that an Englishman's home in his castle, and an Englishman has a right to vote the people who he wishes to vote in to his parliament. Well, that's not absolutely true, is it? Because it was only after the First World War, after the Soviet activity of communism taking over Russia, that something had to be done to prevent that. So one set of figures that I was looking at said that upwards of 70% of all British people, UK people, fighting for Britain in the First World War did not have the right to vote. Because at that time it was only property owning classes. And people over the age of 21, or was it 25? And a property owning class. So you see, the vast majority of people own no property, and obviously people were fighting as young as 18, 19, 20, 21 in that war. Youngsters. So one, they didn't have the right to vote for age, and many, many, many had zero right to vote by the fact that they owned no property. Right? But the propaganda is that all men could vote, when it's total and utter nonsense. And actually, and this is what people need to understand, the suffragettes only wanted for people to vote within their class. So it was a middle class movement set about by middle class women, as Emmeline Pankhurst in the first instance. I'm not saying that working class women didn't join into that movement, but that's what it was in the first instance. Yeah, and she was asking for the same rights as men in that era, not for rights for all people to vote, for universal suffrage of all women and all men. No, just for the men of the right class and women of the right class. So you see the class struggle. So again, you're not taught that, because that doesn't fit. So there's a false narrative that's been provided subsequently. This is your revisionism. This is how it works. So let's look at another issue. All those guys fighting, again, from British colonies, millions of Indians, example. I think about 100,000 Africans, if not more. West Indians, because the populations are extremely small, and Hong Kong Chinese, particularly working on ships, etc., and Singaporeans, etc., fighting in the First World War. Yeah. In fact, it's more than that, because in the First World War there were battles in Africa, actually, against the colonialists. In fact, the first battle in the First World War was between British and German colonial forces. I read for that, black forces run by white officers. Right, that was the first battle of the First World War, actually. So none of these guys had a right to vote. None of them. Not a single one of them. Not a single one of them dying for the cause. So you see, this is again democracy, fighting for democracy, etc., etc. You get the propaganda that was massive at the time of poor little Belgium. Look what the dirty Hun has done to poor little Belgium. When you realise that when Belgium went into the Congo in around about 1884, 1880, 1889, by the time, you had the Treaty of Berlin, didn't you? Which is the treaty whereby in 1884 all European powers came together, carved up Africa and said, right, this is your sphere of influence, this is my sphere of influence, this is yours. Germans, French, Norwegian, Swedish, but these are the spheres of influence. We've got Portuguese, Spanish. These are our spheres of influence. Even the Americans were at the conference. And this is what we'll do. And the maps were drawn, 50 states were drawn out of those maps. And this is what will happen, right? Well, within that sphere of influence, the reason why they were drawn up, many people don't understand. The reason why it came together was because what they feared was that each European country would fight its neighbour in order to get their hands on the African prize. So the discussion was, let's discuss how we don't kill each other when we're taking on these Africans. And in that way, we won't give the Africans an opportunity to defeat us. So in other words, we will swear amongst each other that we won't take each other's colonial possessions, which we are now agreeing on. By the way, no African was at this conference in 1884, obviously. So the agreements were made and they stayed within their spheres of influence. Now, obviously, Britain and France in particular, maybe even the Germans as well at the time, they would have gone behind each other's backs and aided some of the colonial possessions in order so they can get a little bit more. But the bottom line is, as a general rule, they stuck to that agreement, openly at least. So therefore, people did not attack the other European power while it took over its area, and it did what it needed to do against its colony. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is now the reason why today that feed comes back in Niger and in French, what they used to call French West Africa and French Central Africa, because there's certain rules and regulations come back, which I will discuss in a short while subsequently. But poor Belgium had a place, and it had the Belgian Congo, way bigger than Belgium was itself, with a population of something like, when they took over, I believe 20 million people. By the time 20 years had gone by, the population was down to 11 million people. Basically, the Belgian king, who owned the land himself, he was basically exterminating these Congolese people. So 11 million of them lost their lives in an extermination process. Now, the Germans exterminated about 100,000 in what today we call Namibia. And of course, Britain, France, Portuguese, Spaniards, they all had their systems whereby they killed a whole load of people. Indeed, when I was a youngster, I read the book Young Winston. And I remember Churchill saying in there, do we really need to Gatling gun these people down to such a level? And he was talking about one battle which he was having at the time, and it was when he was a reporter. I think it was in Lesotho. Don't quote me on that. But as this is why I say, always look it up. But he was saying, do we really need to exterminate people like this? And Winston wasn't particularly known for having a weak stomach. So you know what was going down was hefty. So what I'm saying is, again, all these things were written out of the books. So when I used to speak to my in-laws when they were alive, who were older people, who happened to be white, they would turn around and say, oh, well, what we did in the empire, we brought schools to them, we brought education, we made sure they had enough to eat. You know, we were civilising the people, because up till then they were killing each other, etc., etc., etc. Forgetting, of course, that Germans, British, French, Belgians, I can go on and on and on, have been killing each other forever and a day. Right? But, you know, somehow Africans killing each other in their battles of conquest are somehow not perceived in the same manner as battles of conquest within Europe. When you want to see the greatest destruction of life, we've just spoken about 27 million Soviets, we've spoken about 450,000. Well, the First World War for Britain was actually a higher death toll. It was 800,000 British people, and of course the colonial experts who lost their lives fighting at that time. But these were, and the French and the Germans lost many more individuals. So these are people killing each other in the most dastardly of ways, gassing individuals, blowing individuals up in any way one could. But that's okay, because that was somehow civilised. But when Africans were doing it in their conflicts for power, no less brutal than any other person's conflict for power, somehow it was barbaric, and they were barbaric people not understanding why they were doing it. But a European did understand why he was doing it. So this is how psychological operations can play on you, and how it can actually make you think that even you doing wrong is doing right. So in other words, you justify the process by the operational aspect, and then the revisionism comes in on top of that. So why would I be speaking about this at this time frame? Because I said I did want to mention something to do with what's going on in the Ukraine and the Russian war now, and I wanted to mention what's going on in Niger. And I also said that what I wanted to mention also was the fact that we're on extremely dangerous times. Or maybe I didn't, but I should have made that clear. We're in extremely dangerous times now, because through much of my life, and I was involved in it in various ways, there was a Cold War going on. And that Cold War was between the East and the West. For that, read Europe and the United States for the West. Throw into that Japan and various other countries in the Far East, and throw into that on the other side the Soviet Union, and throw into that the eastern countries that had been taken by the Soviet Union and chose or were moved into communism, whichever way you want to look at it, after the Second World War. And then add on to that countries that subsequently saw communism as a potential way forward. So that would be in Africa. So, example, in Ethiopia. That would be in Cuba, albeit that I think, to be fair, in the beginning, I think the Cuban Revolution was a nationalist revolution rather than a communist revolution. Let's say it was a nationalist revolution with socialist perspective, not necessarily communist perspective. And so I went for the others. And you could say that would probably be around, in the beginning, would have been around the same for South Africa. Angola may well have been more communistic in its perspective. And obviously you've got the Far East, and you've got Vietnam, you've got Cambodia, which actually was in no way, shape or means communistic, but was advantageous at the original perspective for the American to bomb it to stop the communists coming through. That's the North Vietnamese with roots down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So other countries, Laos, Cambodia, got drawn into the battle, even though they weren't involved in the battle. Secretively, bombings went on there, and then that opened up the way for communist insurgent movement, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge. So this is the perspective that you find, that you were either with the West or with the East, or again the West or again the East. But I would argue that it was more orientated to the fact that the West was losing something rather than, in terms of the East, gaining something. So therefore there was probably a stronger ideological perspective in terms of commerce for the West than there was for the East. The East's ideological perspective was probably more down to theory, i.e. communistic theory, rather than the West's was on keeping hold of colonial possessions, keeping hold of business possessions, because basically in the truth of the matter is that colonies are monopolies, and that's why they're of any use, because they're monopolies. They're areas where you get your raw goods from for even nothing or at a very low price because they are your colony, and it's where you sell back the finished good for an exorbitant price, be it well built or not, but it's profitable. So and then the reason why I mention this is because that's a fundamental part of what we're now seeing in the change in French West Africa. And again, this is where we now come back to all of the past jumping forward to today. So let's look at the conflict in Niger. What has happened generally in the past is that each European country ran its system in a slightly different way. So, example, you could see in France the way they carried out their colonial systems were that they said to the individuals, you are now French. So you were perceived as French nationals. This is what they were basically saying at the time. You are French. So if we don't build schools or universities in your country, it's because you can go to French universities and French schools. We'll give you French basic education. And interestingly enough, in France, it was said that throughout all of the French possessions, at 2:25 on a Wednesday afternoon, everybody learns the same. Be they in France, in French Polynesia, in French West Africa, or in French Americas, wherever you might be, you're learning the same thing because your loyalty is to France. So that is why, under the French system, some people could have been, who are not from France, could be appeased by the belief, and not just the belief, to be fair, by the truth, that you could go to Paris or anywhere in metropolitan France, and in the end, you could be somebody of import. And I give you 2 or 3 examples. So there is Alexandre Dumas' father, who was a general, and one of the generals in charge of the French armies that fought alongside Napoleon, and that actually he was the general in charge of the battle into Egypt. So the conquering of Egypt, he led that. Napoleon above him, but he actually led the battle for that. He was also the individual who led the battle against the Austrians in the mountains in Tyrol region, etc. And there wasn't just one black general, there were actually about 12 or 13 black generals at least, in the French army. In the British military, you would never reach that sort of rank, ever, up until extremely recently. But you're talking now that happening in the 17th century in France, okay? Even in the 16th century. That's totally doable. So that may be stem from 2 things. One, that obviously the Moorish armies fought their way up until Avignon in southern France, so there was some black heritage there in those people, so they could see that that was a factor. But 2, because, as I said, in the colonial time, there was a perspective of how it ran. And even before then, obviously being on the European mainland, you could see that even before the 7th century, when Tariq al-Jabril took over southern Spain, and then northern Spain, then Portugal, then southern France, cross into or his descendants across into Italy, and they were clearly of colour and clearly could be seen. But even before then, it was clear to people that you had, even in the Roman times, a black Roman emperor, example. In fact, I think about 3 of them were black Roman emperors. So blacks could be of power in various places in Europe, and particularly in southern Europe, and obviously there's southern France. So I think the French were a kind of a way acclimatised to that. Obviously, when the slave trade came about, it lessened the import of blacks, as it did everywhere, because what it meant was, hang on, these people are lesser than we are. But originally that wasn't necessarily the case. So again, that's propaganda. New propaganda being put in after, when that slave trade came in, what it then did to the position of blacks. You see, again, you've got to understand how that can be utilised. You know, for one, who says who's... Yeah, this is another factor. Who says who is black? Which person has the right to turn around and say what a black person is? Because I could turn around and say the only people who are white are people who come from Scandinavia, and everybody else, and that would not be taking account of the indigenous peoples from the north, the Laplanders, etc., the Sami. But all the people we now see in our mind when we see a Scandinavian, those are white people. I could turn around and say those people who are not like that, particularly in any part of southern Europe that do not look like that, whose lips have a certain fullness, whose noses have a certain width, whose backsides, particularly in the women, are prognathous. I could turn around and say those are all black people because they're mixed race. And I can make a decision that says those mixed race people are black. The same way as Blumenbach, the fellow who made the races, turned around and said, well, those people in North Africa, I'm going to take them and have them as white people. Originally they weren't, but then subsequently he made them that way. Why? Because obviously he learned about ancient Egypt, and then said, wow, we've got to have those people in. But of course, the people who were Egyptians then, by the 18th century, were not the people who were originally Egyptians back in the pharaonic times. Indeed, I think everybody now accepts, every scientist now accepts, that Homo sapiens sapien, modern day humans, come out of Africa. And if that's the case, then we're all Africans. I mean, there was a study actually made by the Chinese back in the 80s that said Chinese were not from Africans, were not members of the modern human African race. To use that word, I hate the word race because it's biological nonsense. Unfortunately, it's a political reality, so we have to use it. But he basically said, these people, us Chinese, us Han Chinese in particular, are not from these people. We're from a subspecies that came through, and we're the Chinese. And he experimented on tens of thousands of people. Prove it. What it proved is the opposite. I've forgotten his name right now, but please do look him up. As with everything I say, look it up. I've forgotten his name right now, the doctor. I think it might be, I know it's going to sound Dr. Lee, sounds wrong, but it could well be Professor Dr. Lee. And he actually proved the opposite to what he went out to try and prove, and to what he was trying to prove on behalf of the Chinese government. This is what you need to understand. It wasn't some fella doing it for himself. It was on behalf of the Chinese government. And he had to come down to the fact that, yeah, we're descended from the Africans too. So basically, those swathes of population were blacks. So how do we then get them not being blacks? Well, we know that what we get is we got adaptation. But when does the adaptation happen? And when do we start saying that one is not of one species, one race, and one is of another race? When do we make those decisions? So when do we get this idea of black African and somehow white African in the north? Doesn't make any sense. They're just two different types of African. In terms of lighter skinned black Africans and darker skinned black Africans. That's the reality of it. Now, do those lighter skinned black Africans, if they have it want to be black Africans, they may be very, very mixed. So take Egypt example. There's a big furore right now about not being black. They don't want to have ever have been black. The reality is that the iconography, as soon as you go, if you have been there, as I have, any other parts of Egypt, you can go and look at any of the iconography, and you will see that it shows people who anybody would say, if they walked in the United States, that's a black person. Or in Britain, if you were a police officer, you'd say that's an IC3, a black person. But of course, that's the ancient times. So if you want to take those ancient times and build on that as yours, if you are now somebody who's coming from the East, from latter period, you don't want to lose those ancients. You want them to be part of you. So therefore, your argument must be, they were not black, they were a different people. And they showed that by showing other Africans and making a differentiation with themselves. Absolutely. The same way that the French make a differentiation with themselves, with actually even the southern French, to be fair. Now the Germans make a differentiation, definitely Hitler did, between himself, the more Nordic, as he believed it, Aryan classes, and the classes from the south. So all Spaniards, to his mind, were not, unless you were Basque, I believe, were not white, not Aryans. Obviously that's to do with the mixtures with the Moors. But you see, what I'm saying is that who makes these decisions? Who says what is what? And who makes a clear differentiation? Now, the problem with DNA now is they'll say, oh, well, the DNA says it. No, the DNA only says who is in the country at the time. And what is the preponderance of people in that country. So when it says you are, a quarter French, well, that quarter French doesn't tell you what the race of the French person is, it just tells you a quarter French, because this is the preponderance of people in France. What the DNA is of individuals within that preponderance of people of France, it's not telling you. What the connections are between those people, it's not telling you. It's just telling you the preponderance of people from the hapsites that are in there. So, again, this is what's all used in this game that we call psychological operations. Now, up until now, I'm speaking about psychological operations as though, and these things as though they're just something that's just happened, rather than actually stating that they are actually purposeful actions to make people think in a purposeful manner about what's gone on and what is going on. And this is what I'm saying, and this is what I have been saying and am saying. And in part 2 of this, which I will be coming through to next week, I'm going to go into more depth of how we control what individuals think, utilising the media, utilising history, utilising the political thoughts at the time, and utilising the average person's lack of willingness to delve for themselves. So that was part 1 of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.